The mud came down like God's own fist just past dawn. I was checking fence line when I heard it. That deep earth rumble that ain't thunder, ain't wind, just the mountain, deciding it's had enough of holding together. 20 below that morning, frost thick as wool on every wire, and Mercury Creek running mean with snowmelt from 3 days of Chinook winds. I saw the hand first. Small, blue, reaching up through the debris like it was asking permission to live. Took me near 20 minutes to dig through to her, my bare hands clawing frozen mud and splintered timber. Cut my palm open on my own fence wire, blood bright against the snow, mixing with hers where the barbed edge had torn her coat. When I finally pulled her free, she wasn't breathing right. Chest barely moving, lips purple, one side of her face scraped raw, but her fist was closed tight around something. Dark wool fabric, torn clean. Expensive weave, the kind Vernon Moss wore to church. Her eyes snapped open, blue as creek ice and just as cold with knowing. Uncle Vernon pushed me, 4 words that made my blood stop colder than the wind. I carried her to the ranch house, my boots breaking through ice crust with every step. She weighed nothing, 80 pounds soaking wet, and half of that was mud. The wind screamed through the canyon, carrying the smell of wet sage and torn earth. Behind us, the hillside looked like something had taken a bite out of it. Fresh timber, showing pale, where the slide had ripped trees clean from their roots. Inside, I laid her on the kitchen table. My hands shook as I stoked the fire, added logs until the heat pushed back against the morning cold. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old coffee, leather and loneliness. 12 years I'd lived here alone since Martha died, talking to ghosts and fence posts. The girl's breathing came shallow and wet. I wrapped her in every blanket I owned, put heated stones from the fire at her feet. Her left hand, the one that had been clutching that fabric, was frostbitten bad. The fingers wouldn't straighten, locked in a curl like she was still holding evidence. I sent my hired hand Torres into town for Doc Pritchard, told him to ride hard and don't explain nothing to nobody. The sun was barely up, painting the snow orange and red like the earth was bleeding. Doc Eleanor arrived within the hour, her medical bag frozen stiff, her breath coming in white clouds. She was 62 and tough as winter itself, with hands that had delivered half the babies in the territory, and closed the eyes of the other half when they didn't make it. Caleb? She didn't waste words, just moved to the table, unwrapped the blankets, started her examination. I stood by the fire, watching her work. The girl, Lily Hawkins, I knew her daddy before he died last fall, hadn't opened her eyes again. Doc's fingers moved quick and certain, checking for breaks, listening to her chest, examining the frostbite. She'll lose some skin on this hand, Doc said quiet. Maybe a finger if infection sets in, but she'll live, if we're careful. Then Doc picked up the torn fabric from where I'd laid it on the sideboard, held it up to the lamplight, rubbed it between her fingers. Her jaw tightened. This is Vernon Moss's coat. Not a question. That's what I figure. And she said he pushed her? Soon as she came to, clear as church bells. Doc set the fabric down like it burned. Moved to the window, looked out at the canyon where morning light was starting to warm the snow. When she spoke, her voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Caleb, this fabric's from a coat worth more than my clinic. Vernon doesn't tear his clothes on accident. She turned back to me. You know what you're stepping in? I know. I pulled a child out of mud while she was still breathing. I know she spoke truth before she knew enough to lie. Vernon Moss owns half this county. His brother's ranch, Lily's ranch now, legal, sits right between your water access and his eastern property. 400 acres that'd make him a rich man if he sold to the railroad. I'd known Albert Hawkins, Lily's father. Good man, fair neighbor. Died of pneumonia last October, left everything to his daughter in a will that couldn't be contested, or so we'd all thought. You think Vernon kill his own niece for land? Doc's expression went hard as the iron stove. I think men have killed for less, and I think that girl's telling the truth. She paused. But truth and proof are different animals, Caleb, especially when you're accusing a man with lawyers and money in the judge's ear. Before I could answer, we heard horses outside, 3 of them, coming fast. Through the window, I saw Vernon Moss dismount, 2 ranch hands with him. He was 45 and prosperous, with a face that smiled easy and eyes that calculated everything. Today he wore a different coat, new, black, expensive. His damaged one probably burning in a stove somewhere. He didn't knock, just opened my door like he owned it. Caleb, Eleanor. His voice dripped concern like honey from a knife. Heard there was an accident at the creek. My poor niece. Where is she? Sleeping, I said. Didn't move from where I stood between him and the table. Vernon's eyes flicked past me to Lily's still form. Terrible thing, mudslides. That Chinook wind's been loosening the whole hillside for days. I told Albert last year he should clear those trees. He shook his head, the picture of an uncle's grief. I'll take her now. Family should care for family. She stays here. My voice came out flat and final as a headstone. Vernon's smile didn't change, but something shifted behind it. Cold calculation, like a man doing sums in his head. Careful, old man, he said soft enough that his ranch hands couldn't hear. Law protects family, and accidents happen to folks who interfere with a man's bloodkin. Sunday came cold and bitter, the kind of morning where breath freezes in your beard. The church bell rang across the valley, its sound sharp in the thin air. I'd kept Lily at my ranch for 3 days, Doc visiting twice daily to check her frostbite and change the bandages. The girl hadn't said much, just watched me with those blue eyes that saw too damn much for 9 years old. Reverend Hollis Webb was a circuit preacher, 50-something, with a voice that could shake rafters and a spine that didn't bend for money. He'd buried my Martha, baptized half the children in 3 counties, and never once looked away from hard truth. That morning he chose his text deliberate. Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not. I sat in my usual pew, back row, where I could see the whole congregation. Doc Eleanor sat beside me, her medicine bag at her feet like she expected trouble. Sam Redbone stood in the rear. Shoshone didn't sit in white churches, but Sam came anyway, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Vernon Moss sat front row, center. Prime position for a man who donated heavy to the collection plate. His new coat fit perfect, not a thread out of place. The banker Cyrus Wardle sat beside him, a thin man with wire spectacles and the kind of smile that counted your worth before saying, "Good morning." Reverend Webb didn't waste time. "There's been talk," he said, his voice filling the small church, "about accidents and orphans and who has the right to decide a child's fate." He paused, let the silence stretch. "Some of you know Caleb Thorne pulled young Lily Hawkins from a mudslide last Monday, saved her life while risking his own." Murmurs rippled through the pews. I felt eyes turn toward me. "And some of you know," Webb continued, his gaze settling on Vernon, "that her uncle has made claim to guardianship, bloodkin, legal right, proper Christian duty." Another pause. "But I've also heard the child spoke words when she woke. Words about how that mud came to fall." The church went dead quiet. You could hear the wood stove ticking, the wind scratching at the windows. Vernon stood smooth as butter melting. "Reverend, with respect, the girl was delirious. Head injury, cold shock. Doc Pritchard herself said the child was barely conscious." He turned to face the congregation, his expression sorrowful. "My brother's death near broke me. Now his daughter, traumatized, speaking nonsense because her mind can't accept that nature took her parents." His voice caught just right. "I only want to care for her, as Albert would have wanted." "The girl wasn't delirious." Doc Eleanor's voice cut through like a surgical blade. She stood, and every head turned. She was clear-minded enough to hold on to evidence. Fabric torn from an expensive coat, wool that matches what Vernon Moss wore until 3 days ago. The murmurs got louder. Vernon's jaw tightened, but his smile held. "Are you calling me a liar, Eleanor?" "I'm saying fabric doesn't lie. Neither do children when they first wake from trauma. They don't have time to invent stories yet." Banker Wardell stood then, his voice oily with reason. "This is hardly the place for accusations. Mr. Moss has been a pillar of this community. His financial contributions have kept this church standing, kept businesses running through hard times." He looked around the room. "We all know Caleb Thorne, good man, but alone too long, perhaps a bit addled by grief, seeing threats where there's only tragedy." I felt the shift then, saw it in faces I'd known for decades. The landowners, the merchants, the folks who owed Vernon money or favors, they looked away, found sudden interest in their hymnals. Only the laborers, the drifters, the ones with nothing to lose, met my eyes. The church was splitting right down the middle, invisible as a wound, but just as real. Reverend Webb raised his hand for silence. "This matter will be decided by law, not gossip. Judge McAllister holds court tomorrow in Bridger. Until then, the child stays where she's safe and healing." The child," Vernon said, his voice hardening, "stays with family." Half the congregation stood with him. The banker, the general store owner, the lawyer's wife, a dozen others. They moved toward the aisle, their message clear: stand with Vernon or stand alone. The other half stayed seated. Doc Eleanor, Sam Redbone, a handful of ranch hands and washerwomen and folks who knew what it meant to be powerless. Vernon stopped at my pew on his way out. Leaned in close, his breath smelling of peppermint and spite. "Judge'll hear this tomorrow, Thorne. And when he does, you'll learn what interfering costs." Monday morning, the courthouse in Bridger smelled of beeswax and old tobacco. Judge Angus McAllister presided from behind a desk, scarred with 30 years of frontier justice. Some of it fair, most of it expedient. He was 60, balding, with a face like weathered granite, and eyes that calculated politics before principle. Vernon's lawyer from the territorial capital wore a suit that cost more than my ranch cleared in a year. He laid papers on the judge's desk with the precision of a card-sharp dealing aces. "Your Honor, my client presents his brother's last will and testament, properly notarized, Dated March of 1885, he slid the document forward. Albert Hawkins clearly states that should anything happen to him, guardianship of his daughter Lily passes to his brother Vernon, along with management of the estate until she reaches majority. I felt my stomach drop. Doc Eleanor, sitting beside me in the gallery, went rigid. That's a lie, I said, standing. Albert told me himself last summer he'd never sign over guardianship to Vernon, said his brother had debts and schemes and no business near his daughter. The lawyer smiled without warmth. Hearsay, Your Honor, against a legally executed document bearing Albert Hawkins' Sueda's signature and notary seal. Judge McAllister examined the will, held it up to the light streaming through the courthouse windows. The paper looked old enough, the signature fluid and confident. The notary stamp, William Greaves, a man who'd left town 6 months back under unclear circumstances, sat in the corner, official as Sunday. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, his voice tired, do you have any legal standing in this matter? I have a child who said her uncle tried to kill her. A child who was, by all medical accounts, suffering head trauma and cold shock. He set the will down. Mr. Moss, I find this document authentic and binding. Emergency guardianship is hereby granted. The child will be released to your custody immediately. Vernon's smile could have curdled fresh milk. Your Honor, Doc Eleanor started. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down hard as a gunshot. Vernon stood, buttoned his coat, and turned to me. His voice dropped low enough that only I could hear. Water rights meetings Friday, Thorne. You need easement across Lily's property to reach Mercury Creek, else your herd dies of thirst come summer. Sign over the rights to me permanent, and maybe the girl lives long enough to see her 10th birthday. Refuse, and accidents happen. He walked out into the winter sunlight, already a winter. Sam Redbone came to my ranch that evening, riding a paint horse older than both of us combined. The sun was setting, turning the snow orange and purple, and the temperature was already dropping toward another bitter night. I was at the fence line, doing what I always did when my mind needed settling, checking wire tension, replacing rusted staples, the kind of work that let thoughts unspool slow and steady. Sam dismounted, moved quiet as smoke across the frozen ground. He was Shoshone, 70 if he was a day, with a face carved from weather and wisdom. His ranch bordered mine to the north, 300 acres he'd held onto through treaties and broken promises, and every scheme white men invented to take native land. Caleb, he stood beside me watching the fence line. The wire sang in the wind, a high, lonesome sound like the earth was humming grief. Sam. We worked in silence for a bit. That was Sam's way. Never rushed a conversation. Let words come when they were ready. The smell of cold sage drifted up from the valley, mixing with the scent of snow and horse leather. Saw Vernon 3 days before the slide, Sam finally said. He was up on that ridge above Mercury Creek, surveying, had an axe with him. My hand stopped on the wire. Surveying what? Trees, the big pines that were holding that hillside. Sam's eyes met mine, dark and certain. He marked 6 of them, not for timber, wrong angle for hauling, marked them to cut, to weaken the slope. You're saying he planned it. I'm saying a man doesn't mark trees 3 days before they come down in a slide by accident. Sam paused. Tracks are still there, Caleb. His boot prints in the mud, frozen now. Axe marks on the stumps, fresh enough to count the days. Hope kindled in my chest, dangerous as a spark near dry timber. That's evidence. That's proof Vernon knew that hillside was going to fail. White judge won't hear Shoshone testimony worth a damn, Sam said quiet. You know that. Need proof he can't ignore. Something that don't require him trusting my word against Vernon's money. The wind picked up, cutting through my coat. In the distance, a coyote called, lonely and sharp. I'll find it, I said. There's gotta be something. Sam nodded, started back toward his horse, then stopped, turned back. That girl, she's stronger than she looks, got her mama's spine. His voice softened. Her mama was good people. Sarah Hawkins didn't deserve what happened. What do you mean? But Sam was already mounting, his paint horse turning toward home. Check your barn, Caleb. Albert stored things there sometimes when he didn't want them at his own place. He rode off into the gathering dark, leaving me with more questions than answers. I searched the barn by lamplight, the smell of hay and old leather thick in the cold air. Mice skittered in the walls. The wind found every crack in the boards, making the whole structure creak and sigh like something alive. It took me an hour to find it. A leather satchel wedged behind hay bales in the back corner, covered in dust and mouse droppings. Inside was Albert Hawkins' ranch journal, the kind every rancher kept to track breeding and weather, and the 1,000 small details that meant survival or failure. The journal was water damaged, pages stuck together, ink running in places, but enough was readable. I sat on a hay bale and went through it page by careful page, my breath clouding in the lamplight. March 1885. Vernon came by again today, demanding I sell him the creek access, offered $2,000, which is half what it's worth. When I refused, he got ugly. Said accidents happen to stubborn men, May 1885. Found survey stakes on my property line. Old markers moved 6 feet onto my land. Vernon's doing, I'd wager. Trying to claim he owns the water rights, not me. Move them back, he'll try again. September 1885. Vernon brought that snake notary Greaves around, tried to get me to sign papers for Lily's protection in case something happened to me. Told him where he could put his papers. He said I'd regret it. I told him, blood don't mean loyalty when a man's heart runs to greed. October 1885, just weeks before Albert died. Feeling poorly, lungs tight. Vernon visited, seemed almost pleased I'm sick. Mentioned again how Lily would be better off with family who could manage her inheritance properly. Mess over my dead body. The last entry was dated 2 days before Albert's death. The handwriting shook, but the words were clear. If you're reading this and I'm gone, know this. I never signed Vernon's guardianship paper. Never would. That man wants my land for the railroad money, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it. Don't trust him with Lily. Don't trust him with anything. The earth and the law are different masters, and Vernon only serves one. I sat there in the cold barn, holding proof that Vernon had threatened Albert, had moved property markers, had pressed for guardianship while his brother was dying. It wasn't evidence of attempted murder, not directly, but it was a pattern, clear as boot prints in snow. The barn door creaked open. I looked up, hand moving toward the rifle I kept near the door. Doc Eleanor stepped in, her medical bag in hand, her face grim. Caleb, we've got trouble. Judge signed the custody order this afternoon. Vernon's coming tomorrow with the marshal to take Lily. She saw the journal in my hands. What's that? Proof Vernon's been after that land for over a year. Proof Albert didn't trust him. Doc moved closer, read over my shoulder. When she finished, her expression was hard as winter stone. Water damage makes it inadmissible in court. Any lawyer worth his salt will argue the ink's too run, the date's uncertain. She touched the page gently. But it's truth, Caleb, even if it won't stand in front of a judge. From the ranch house we heard it, a child crying, sharp and frightened. Lily, probably dreaming of mud and falling, and her uncle's face above her. Doc met my eyes. We've got maybe 12 hours before Vernon shows up with legal paper that says she's his. What are we going to do? Doc Eleanor didn't go home that night. She stayed at the ranch, sleeping in the chair by Lily's bed, her medical bag close like a shield that wouldn't hold. I sat at the kitchen table with Albert's journal, reading the entries over and over, looking for something that would matter to a judge who'd already decided which side his bread was buttered. Morning came gray and cold, the sky the color of dirty wool. I was outside splitting wood when I saw the rider coming. Not Vernon, but someone else. A woman on a bay mare, riding fast enough to mean trouble. It was Margaret Chen, the banker's clerk. She pulled up hard, her horse blowing steam, her face flushed despite the cold. Thorne, I shouldn't be here. Her voice shook. But Doc Pritchard's been good to my family, and this ain't right. What ain't right? But Wardle, the banker, he came to Doc's clinic this morning. Early, before she opened. Margaret looked over her shoulder like Vernon might materialize from the wind. He's calling in her loan. The one she took out 3 years back to expand the clinic, buy new equipment. My gut went cold. How much does she owe? $1,800, due in full by end of month, or he forecloses. Margaret's eyes filled. Mr. Thorne, everybody knows Doc can't raise that kind of money in 3 weeks. Most of her patients pay in chickens and labor. She'd have to sell the clinic, and there ain't another doctor within 40 miles. And Vernon put him up to this. I didn't hear that direct, but Mr. Wardell met with Mr. Moss yesterday afternoon, right after the courthouse. She twisted the reins in her hands. And this morning, Mr. Wardell told Doc that if she testified the Hawkins girl was mentally unsound from trauma, he might be able to extend the loan terms. Give her more time. The axe handle felt solid in my grip, and for a moment I understood why men resorted to violence when words and law failed them. Vernon wasn't just taking Lily. He was destroying anyone who might stand for her. Margaret, you tell Doc I'll cover that loan. Mr. Thorne, you don't have... I'll find it. Even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. I had maybe $300 in the bank, another $100 in coin buried in the cabin. My ranch cleared enough to keep me fed, and the property taxes paid. Nothing more. $1,800 might as well have been $18,000. Margaret nodded, knowing the same truth I did, and rode off toward town. They came at noon. Marshal Tom Reeves led the way, a decent man trapped in an indecent situation, his badge catching the weak sunlight. Vernon rode beside him, and behind them came 2 ranch hands I didn't recognize. Hired muscle from out of territory, the kind of men who did what they were paid for and didn't ask questions about right or wrong. I stood on my porch, Doc Eleanor beside me. Inside, Lily watched through the window, her small face pale against the glass. Caleb. Marshal Reeves dismounted, held up the paper. You know why I'm here. Judge's order. The girl goes with her uncle. She's safe here, Tom. Law says different. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Don't make this harder than it is. Vernon dismounted smooth, straightened his coat. Today he wore gloves. Expensive leather, the kind that didn't show blood or dirt. Lily, sweetheart, it's time to come home. Uncle Vernon's going to take care of you now. Doc Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp as a scalpel. That child has frostbite that needs daily treatment. I'm in the middle of a medical protocol, which you can continue at my ranch, Vernon interrupted. I'll pay you for your time, Eleanor. Professional rates. The way he said it made it sound like a bribe and a threat all at once. The door opened. Lily stood there in a dress Doc had brought her, too big in the shoulders, her bandaged hand held close to her chest. She looked at Vernon, and I saw something in her eyes that no 9-year-old should know. The recognition of a predator, the certainty of what was coming. I don't want to go. Sweetheart, you're confused. The cold, the accident, it's made you scared of the wrong things. Vernon moved toward the porch, his smile gentle as poison. I'm your family, your blood, the only family you have left. My daddy said you were a snake. Vernon's smile cracked for just a second. Then it rebuilt itself, smoother than before. Your daddy was sick when he said things like that. Sick in his mind, maybe, from the pneumonia. People say things they don't mean when fever takes them. Except he wasn't fevered when he wrote it. I held up the journal. Got it right here, Vernon. Every threat you made, every scheme you tried, dated and documented. Marshal Reeves looked uncomfortable. Caleb, is that inadmissible? Vernon said flatly. Water damaged, unclear dates, could have been written by anyone. My lawyer will tear it apart in 30 seconds. He turned to the marshal. We're done talking. Take the girl. Tom, don't do this. Doc Eleanor's voice broke. She's terrified of him. You can see it. I got a court order that says different than what I see. Marshal Reeves moved toward the porch, his face a mask of professional duty covering personal shame. Miss Lily, you need to come with us now. Lily looked at me. In her eyes was a question that would haunt me the rest of my life. Are you going to let this happen? Stepped between her and the marshal. No. Vernon's laugh was short and ugly. You're refusing a legal order, Thorne. That's contempt of court. Tom, arrest him if he interferes. The marshal's hand went to his pistol, not drawing, just touching it, making his position clear. Caleb, step aside. I don't want to do this the hard way. Behind me, Lily started crying. Not loud, just quiet sobs that shook her small frame. Please, she whispered. Please don't make me go. Doc Eleanor put her hand on my arm. In her eyes, I saw the same calculation I was making. We could fight now and lose everything, or we could step aside and find another way. Neither choice was bearable, but one was fatal. Vernon moved past me, climbed the porch steps. Lily backed against the door, but there was nowhere to go. He took her good hand, not rough, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away. Proprietary, possessive. Come along, sweetheart. We have a lot to talk about. He led her to his horse, lifted her into the saddle. She didn't fight, just sat there stiff and silent, tears running down her face. The marshal mounted. The hired men formed up around them like prison guards. Vernon paused before mounting, turned back to me. His voice dropped low enough that only I could hear. Water rights meetings Friday at the land office. Thorne, 3 days from now. You sign over permanent easement to Mercury Creek, give me control of the water access across Lily's property, and maybe I don't work her too hard at the ranch. Maybe I remember to feed her regular. Maybe accidents don't happen when she's near the well, or the horses, or any of the other dangerous things on a working ranch. My hands clenched into fists. You're threatening a child. I'm explaining reality. Your cattle need that creek come summer. Without the easement, they die of thirst, your ranch fails, and the bank takes everything you got. He smiled. Or you sign the paper, I get what I want, and Lily grows up safe. Your choice, old man, but choose fast. Little girls are fragile things. He mounted and rode off with his prize. Lily's face turned back toward me, watching until they disappeared into the distance where the land met the gray sky. Doc Eleanor stood beside me, her whole body shaking, not from cold, but from rage so pure it was almost holy. Caleb, we can't let him— I know. My voice came out dead flat. But right now, the law's on his side, the judge is in his pocket, and we got nothing but a water-damaged journal and a Shoshone elder's testimony that won't get heard. So what do we do? I watched the riders disappear, dust rising behind them like the trail of something dying. We find another way. One that don't require judges or lawyers or any of the men Vernon's already bought. I woke before dawn the next morning, same as I had every day for 12 years. The ritual never changed. Pull-on boots, still cold from the night, shrug into a coat that smelled of wood smoke and work, walk the fence line while the world was still dark, and the stars bright enough to read by if you knew their language. The wire sang different songs depending on tension and temperature. Today it hummed low and mournful, ice crystals catching starlight like frozen tears. My breath came in white clouds. The smell of sage and snow filled the air, clean and sharp enough to cut. I walked the northern boundary, checking staples and splice points, my hands working automatic while my mind turned over the problem of Vernon Moss. A man with money and law on his side was near impossible to beat straight on. Had to come at him sideways, find the weakness he didn't know he was showing. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, painting the snow gold and orange. That's when I saw it. A wooden stake, old and weathered, sticking up through a snowdrift near the property line. I knelt, brushed away the snow with my gloved hand. The stake was stamped with a surveyor's mark, 1883 Hawkins Moss boundary. I looked at my fence line, then back at the stake. They didn't match. The fence ran 6 feet onto what should have been Hawkins' property, according to the old survey. 6 feet that would include the best creek access, the spot where the water ran clearest and the banks were easiest for cattle to reach. Vernon had moved his property line, probably after Albert died, before anyone thought to check. And if he'd lied about the boundary, if he'd falsified the property records. The sound of hoofbeats brought my head up. Sam Redbone rode toward me through the morning light, his paint horse's breath steaming. Found something? Sam dismounted, studied the stake. Old survey marker. Shows Vernon's been claiming land that ain't his. I stood, my knees protesting the cold. Sam, you said you tracked his boot prints at the slide site. Are they still there? Frozen solid. Snow's been light. They'll hold until spring melt. Can you prove they're his in a way that'd convince folks who don't want to believe? Sam smiled, thin and knowing. His right boot's got a nick in the heel, shaped like a crescent moon, made by a farrier's hammer, probably. Distinctive enough to match if we had the boot to compare. He paused. But getting Vernon to give up his boots for inspection ain't likely. What if we didn't need the boot? What if we just needed everyone to see the print? See that it matches other places Vernon's been? White folks trust Shoshone tracking about as much as they trust spring ice. Sam's voice held no bitterness, just statement of fact. Need something more than my word. The sun climbed higher, warming the air just enough to make icicles drip from fence posts. The sound was like a clock ticking, counting down the days until Friday's water rights meeting. What if we didn't go through the judge? I said slowly. What if we went through the church? Sam raised an eyebrow. Reverend Webb's got standing in this community. He can call for a baptism, a public ceremony. Vernon couldn't refuse without looking like he don't believe in God's grace. And if we held it at Mercury Creek, right where the slide happened, everyone would be standing at the site where the evidence is. Sam's smile widened. And if someone happened to point out boot prints that matched what Vernon was wearing, and it ain't a court of law, but it's a court of public opinion, and Vernon needs that more than he knows. That evening we gathered at Doc Eleanor's clinic, me, Sam, Doc, and Reverend Webb. The clinic smelled of carbolic and dried herbs, clean and purposeful. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward another bitter night. But inside, Doc's stove kept the small room warm enough to shed coats. Doc set coffee on the table, strong enough to strip paint. We sat in mismatched chairs, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The weight of what we were planning hung heavy as smoke. Baptism, Reverend Webb said finally. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from carpentry work he did between circuit riding. Public ceremony at Mercury Creek, you're asking me to turn a sacrament into a trial. I'm asking you to use the one venue Vernon Moss can't control, I said. He owns the judge, the banker, half the landowners. But he don't own Sunday morning, and he don't own what folks see with their own eyes when they're gathered for God's work. Webb stared into his coffee. If I do this, half my congregation walks. The half that has money, that keeps the church standing. And the other half sees you chose righteousness over silver. Doc's voice was quiet but firm. Hollis, you've known me 30 years. I delivered that girl's mother. I held Sarah Hawkins' hand when she died 3 years back, and she made me promise, made me swear on scripture, that I'd look after Lily if anything happened to Albert. Her voice broke. I'm her godmother, Hollis. Not official in law maybe, but sworn before God. And I'm watching a murderer take her because I'm too scared to lose my clinic. The silence stretched. Outside, wind rattled the windows. What exactly are you proposing? Webb asked. Sam leaned forward. I perform a tracking ceremony, traditional Shoshone blessing for the site where harm was done, part of the baptism ritual, making the ground holy again. While I do it, I show the boot prints to everyone there. Let them see the evidence with their own eyes, not filtered through lawyers and judges. And I read from Albert's journal, I added. Parts that show Vernon's been scheming for that land since before his brother died. It's water damaged, but it's readable enough for folks to hear the pattern. And I present Lily's mother's locket, Doc said. She pulled it from her pocket, a small gold oval on a chain, tarnished with age. Sarah gave me one just like it when Lily was born. I kept in mine. This one was hers. Vernon doesn't know it exists, probably buried in creek mud, but I can search for it once the thaw starts. It proves I'm godmother, proves I have standing to speak for that girl. Webb set down his coffee cup. The sound was loud in the quiet room. If we do this, Vernon will come for all of us. The banker will call in Doc's loan. Vernon will contest my authority with the territorial diocese. Sam, your water rights treaty gets challenged every few years. Vernon will make sure the next challenge succeeds. He looked at each of us in turn. This could cost us everything we got. Then we'll have lost it standing for something that matters, Doc said. Webb smiled, slow and grim. Sarah Hawkins was a good woman. Didn't deserve to die young, and her daughter don't deserve what Vernon's planning. He stood, offered his hand. I'll schedule the baptism for May 15th. Gives us time to prepare, and it's after the water rights meeting, so Vernon can't use that as leverage to make you fold. That's 5 days past the probate deadline, I said. If we wait that long, so Vernon thinks he's won, thinks he's got the land, got the water rights, got everything wrapped up legal and proper. Webb's eyes hardened. Then we show the whole territory what kind of man they've been protecting. Sam nodded. The earth will hold the evidence until we're ready. Snow's light this year, tracks will last. We shook hands, all four of us, sealing a pact that might save a child or ruin us all. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and uncaring. But in that small clinic, with coffee cooling on the table and determination settling in our bones, it felt like something was shifting, like winter might finally be thinking about breaking. Friday came with a warm wind from the south, a false spring that made the snow weep and the creeks run high. I rode into Bridger for the water rights meeting, my gut tight as barbed wire. The land office sat above the general store, smelling of ink and old paper and the accumulated disputes of men fighting over acres and water. Vernon was already there, sitting at the long table with his lawyer and a stack of documents. Banker Wardell sat beside him, looking pleased as a cat with cream. Judge McAllister would oversee the proceedings, not a trial, but official enough to be binding. I took my seat across from them, alone. No lawyer, no witnesses. Just a rancher trying to hold on to what kept him alive. The judge shuffled papers, cleared his throat. We're here to discuss water easement across the Hawkins property, specifically the access to Mercury Creek that Mr. Thorne has used for 12 years under informal agreement with the deceased Albert Hawkins. He looked at me over his spectacles. Mr. Moss, as legal guardian of Miss Hawkins and manager of her estate, contests this easement and demands either formal purchase or cessation of use. Vernon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client is willing to grant permanent easement in exchange for a one-time payment of $6,000 or annual lease of $400, retroactive to the date of Mr. Hawkins's death. $6,000 was everything I had and everything I'd never have. $400 annual was more than I cleared in a good year. Either way, I was done. I can't pay that, I said flat. Then you acknowledge you have no legal right to the water access? I acknowledge that Vernon's trying to steal what Albert gave freely in exchange for help with spring branding and fence work. We had an agreement, handshake and honor, the way neighbors used to settle things. Vernon smiled. Handshakes die with the men who made them, Thorne. My brother's gone. His daughter's a child. I'm responsible for her property now, and I'm not running a charity. He leaned back, confident. Sign the paper, pay the fee, or your cattle don't drink come summer. Simple business. Before I could answer, the door opened. Margaret Chin, the banker's clerk, stood there with her coat dusted with snow, her face flushed. Excuse me, Judge, but there's a matter at the general store that needs attention. Folks are saying things about Mr. Thorne. Wardell frowned. Margaret, this isn't the time. It's about kidnapping, sir, and fraud. Thought the judge should hear it before making decisions about water rights. The room went quiet. Vernon's smile tightened. We adjourned to the general store, where half the town seemed to have gathered. I recognized the faces, the ones who'd walked out of church with Vernon, the ones who'd chosen money over conscience. And in the middle of them stood Ada Morrison, the school teacher, holding what looked like a newspaper clipping. Miss Morrison, Judge McAllister said, his voice tired. What's this about? I've been troubled by this whole situation, Ada said. She was 40-something, unmarried, with the kind of spine that came from managing children who didn't want to learn. So I did some checking, wrote to the Territorial Registry Office in Cheyenne, asked about Mr. Thorne's history, any criminal records or complaints. Vernon shifted his weight, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not quite fear, more like a man realizing his cards weren't as good as he'd thought. And what did you find? The judge asked. Nothing on Mr. Thorne. Clean record for 30 years. But I got curious about something else. Ada held up a telegram. I asked about Vernon Moss's financial standing. Turns out he owes substantial gambling debts to a syndicate in Denver. $23,000? Due by June? With interest accumulating at 2% per month? The crowd murmured. Vernon's face went red. That's a private matter. And he's been negotiating with the railroad to sell the Hawkins property, Ada continued. Correspondence shows he's asked for $12,000 cash, immediate payment, exactly half what he owes, and exactly the amount he'd get if he sold 400 acres at $30 per acre. Where did you get to that information? Vernon's voice had lost its smooth edge. The railroad agent is my cousin. He thought the deal seemed rushed, mentioned it in a letter. Ada met his eyes. You're not trying to protect your niece's inheritance, Mr. Moss. You're trying to liquidate it to pay your debts? And if Lily had died in that mudslide, there'd be no contested guardianship, no questions asked. Just a tragic accident and you inheriting everything clean. The general store erupted in noise, voices rising, accusations flying. Judge McAllister banged his hand on the counter for order. That's speculation, Miss Morrison. Circumstantial at best. Then why did Mr. Moss need a new coat 3 days after the mudslide? Sam Redbone's voice cut through the chaos. He stood in the doorway, snow melting off his shoulders. The one he wore before got torn on something. Maybe barbed wire, maybe a frightened girl's grip when he pushed her. Vernon stood so fast his chair fell over. This is absurd. Tom, he looked at the marshal. Arrest these people for slander. Can't arrest folks for asking questions, Marshal Reeves said quietly. He looked uncomfortable, but resolute. Though I admit these are questions worth asking. I found Sam outside the general store an hour later. The meeting had dissolved into chaos. The water rights decision postponed while Judge McAllister reviewed new information. And it wasn't a win, but it wasn't a loss either. More like a stalemate that bought us time. That was dangerous, I said, accusing him public like that. Truth's always dangerous to men like Vernon. Sam pulled out a small leather pouch, opened it to show me what was inside, a plaster cast, about 6 inches square, showing the clear impression of a boot heel. Made this 2 days ago from the print at the slide site. See that, Nick? Shaped like a crescent moon. I looked at the cast, then back at Sam. We need to match it to Vernon's actual boot. We will. At the baptism, Sam smiled. Man can't very well refuse to take off his boots when he's standing in creek water for a religious ceremony, and if his heel happens to have the same distinctive mark. You're a devious old fox, Sam Redbone. I'm practical. And I'm tired of watching guilty men walk free while good folks suffer. And he tucked the cast back into his coat. Besides, the girl's mama was kind to my granddaughter when most white families wouldn't let their children play with native kids. Sarah Hawkins earned this help, even if she ain't here to see it. Then we stood in the cold street, watching townspeople drift away in clusters, their conversations animated with speculation and doubt. Vernon's armor was cracking, not broken yet, but showing fractures. How's Lily? I asked. Sam's expression darkened. Saw her at Vernon's ranch yesterday. She's working, hauling water, feeding chickens, scrubbing floors. He's treating her like hired help, not kin. And she's got a bruise on her cheek that wasn't there before. My hands clenched into fists. We've got 3 weeks until the baptism. That's a long time for a 9-year-old girl, in a house with a man who wants her dead. Well, then we make sure she survives those 3 weeks, Sam said. I'll ride by Vernon's place regular, make it known folks are watching. Doc can insist on medical check-ins. Reverend can make pastoral visits. He put his hand on my shoulder. And you keep working the legal angle. Find that locket Doc mentioned, track down the notary who supposedly witnessed Albert's will, build the case piece by piece until Vernon's got nowhere to hide. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of wet earth and possibility. Winter was breaking, slow and reluctant, but breaking nonetheless. 3 weeks, I said, and then we end this. Doc Eleanor came to my ranch 3 nights before the baptism. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw her face, pale and drawn, with the kind of exhaustion that came from wrestling with conscience. We sat at my kitchen table. The cabin smelled of coffee and the leftover stew I'd been eating for 3 days. Outside, the sound of spring rain drummed on the roof, steady and insistent. The snow was nearly gone now, mud season turning everything brown and slick. I need to tell you something, Doc said. Her hands shook around her coffee cup. Something I should have told you weeks ago. I waited. The lamplight flickered, casting shadows that made her look older than her 62 years. I didn't just deliver Lily. I was there when her mother died. Doc's voice cracked. Sarah Hawkins, 3 years back. She'd been sick for weeks. Fever, weakness, couldn't keep food down. I thought it was influenza at first, but it wasn't. The rain intensified, hammering the roof like judgment. Albert called me out to their ranch in the middle of the night. Sarah was convulsing, barely breathing. I did everything I could, but she died before dawn. Doc looked at me, her eyes red. Before she passed, she grabbed my hand, made me swear, on scripture and my medical oath, that if anything happened to Albert, I'd protect Lily from Vernon. She knew, I said quietly. She knew he was dangerous. She said Vernon had been asking about the ranch, about water rights, about what would happen if Albert died without a clear will. She said, "He's got the devil's hunger in him, Eleanor. Don't let him near my baby." Doc's voice broke completely, and I promised. I gave her my word while she was dying. She pulled something from her coat pocket, a locket on a tarnished chain, small gold dented on one side. She opened it to show 2 photographs, a young woman with Lily's eyes and a baby girl with a shock of dark hair. Sarah gave me this the day Lily was born. Said we'd both have one, sisters in spirit if not blood. She kept hers, I kept mine. Doc set it on the table between us. I'm Lily's godmother, Caleb. Not in law, maybe, but before God and Sarah's deathbed. And I've been standing by while Vernon takes her because I was scared of losing my clinic. Eleanor, let me finish. She wiped her eyes roughly. Wardell came to see me this morning. Said if I testified at the baptism, said anything about being godmother or having Sarah's deathbed promise, he'd foreclose immediately. I'd lose everything. The clinic, my home, 30 years of work. The lamplight caught the locket, making it gleam like a small sun on the dark table. But if I don't speak up, I break an oath I made to a dying woman. I let her daughter suffer what Sarah feared most. Doc's hand steadied. So I'm speaking up. At the baptism, I'm presenting this locket and claiming my right as godmother to contest Vernon's guardianship, even if it costs me everything. I picked up the locket, felt its weight, light as a bird's bone, heavy as a promise. We'll find a way to save your clinic. Maybe, maybe not. Doc stood, moved to the window. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the darkness outside. But I made a promise to Sarah Hawkins, and I'm keeping it, even if it ruins me. The next day, Reverend Webb sent word through the territory, baptism ceremony at Mercury Creek, Sunday morning, all welcome. The announcement spread like wildfire, in saloons and churches, general stores and ranch houses. By Saturday, half the county knew about it. Vernon couldn't refuse. To skip a public baptism for his own niece would mark him as godless in a territory where church attendance was one of the few things that separated civilized folk from outlaws. That evening, I rode with Sam to Mercury Creek to prepare the site. The rain had stopped, leaving everything washed clean and new. The creek ran high and fast, swollen with snowmelt, the sound like constant thunder. The smell of wet earth and sage filled the air. "Here," Sam said, kneeling by the mud bank. "This is where the boot print was clearest." I looked. The print was still there, frozen mud now melting, but preserved enough to see the distinctive crescent-shaped nick in the right heel. Sam had marked it with small stones, subtle enough not to draw attention until the right moment. "And the slide site?" I asked. Sam pointed upstream to where the hillside still showed scars from the mudslide. Torn earth, uprooted trees, raw stone exposed. Fresh axe marks are visible on 3 stumps. Anyone who knows forestry will see they were cut deliberate, angled to weaken the slope. We stood in the gathering dusk, listening to the creek sing its rushing song. Tomorrow, this place would be crowded with townspeople, with believers and doubters, with Vernon Moss forced to stand in the very spot where he'd tried to murder his niece. "Think it'll be enough?" I asked. Sam smiled, thin and knowing. "The earth don't lie, Caleb. Neither does a dying woman's promise. Between the two, truth's got a fighting chance." And above us, the first stars appeared, cold and distant and bearing witness to what was coming. Sunday morning broke clear and warm, the kind of May day that made you believe winter was finally done trying to kill you. The sky stretched blue and endless, and the smell of wildflowers drifted up from the valley. Lupine and paintbrush, the first brave blooms, pushing through mud and memory. By 9 o'clock, it seemed like half the territory had gathered at Mercury Creek. Families came in wagons, horseback, some walking from nearby ranches. They lined both banks of the creek, standing in clusters that showed exactly where loyalties lay. Vernon's supporters on the east bank, near the road, while the laborers and doubters gathered west, closer to the slide site. Reverend Webb stood in the creek itself, water running past his knees, his white baptismal robe billowing in the current. His Bible was wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the spray. I stood with Doc, Eleanor, and Sam on the west bank. Doc wore her Sunday dress, dark blue, with Sarah's locket hanging visible at her throat. Sam had dressed formal, too, beaded vest over clean shirt, his gray hair braided and wrapped with leather cord. He carried a bundle of dried sage, ready for the blessing ceremony. Vernon arrived last, making an entrance. He rode a black gelding, expensive saddle gleaming in the sunlight, and beside him on a smaller horse sat Lily. The girl wore a white dress, too large, probably borrowed, and her bandaged hand was hidden in the folds of fabric. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and watchful. When Vernon dismounted, I saw his boots. Fine leather, polished, with a heel that caught the light just right. And there, visible even from 20 feet away, was the distinctive crescent-shaped nick in the right heel. Sam saw it too. He nodded once, barely perceptible. Vernon helped Lily down, his hand on her shoulder proprietary and firm. She moved like a captive, trying not to spook her captor. The crowd parted as they walked toward the creek, and I heard the whispers, some sympathetic to Vernon, others questioning, a few openly hostile. Judge McAllister was there, looking official and uncomfortable. Marshal Reeves stood near the back, hand resting casual on his gun belt. And scattered throughout the crowd were the faces that mattered. The banker Wardell, the schoolteacher Ada Morrison, Margaret Chen the clerk, a dozen ranchers and their wives who'd watched this unfold and were finally ready to see the truth. Reverend Webb raised his hands for silence. The crowd quieted, even the creek seeming to hush its rushing voice. "We gather today beside waters that have witnessed tragedy," Webb began, his voice carrying across the valley. 3 months ago, a child nearly died here. A mountainside fell. A life was saved by the hands of a neighbor who stopped when others might have passed by. Vernon's smile stayed fixed, but his eyes scanned the crowd, calculating. "Before we proceed with baptism," Webb continued, "we honor this ground with blessing. Sam Redbone, elder of the Shoshone people who held these lands before treaties and deeds, will sanctify this place where harm was done." Sam stepped forward, lit his sage bundle. The smoke rose white and clean, smelling of high desert and ancient wisdom. He walked to the slide site, speaking in Shoshone, words I didn't understand but felt in my bones. Then he switched to English. "The earth keeps record of all that walks upon it," Sam said. He knelt by the mud bank, gestured to the boot print preserved in drying mud. This mark was made the day of the slide. "See the heel? See how it's cut with a crescent shape? Like the moon when it's dying." The crowd pressed closer. Vernon's smile cracked. And here, Sam moved upstream to the exposed tree stumps. 3 trees, cut deliberate to weaken the hillside. Fresh axe marks, made days before the slide. Any logger can see these weren't cut for timber, they were cut to cause failure. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Vernon started to speak, but Reverend Webb held up his hand. Let him finish. Sam walked back to where Vernon stood. "The man who made this print wore boots with a distinctive mark. Same mark I saw in his barn when I visited 2 days ago. Same mark," he pointed at Vernon's right boot, "and that's on those boots right there." All eyes went to Vernon's feet. He stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd had closed in without him noticing, a noose of witnesses tightening. "This is absurd," Vernon said, his voice tight. "You're taking the word of an Indian tracker over what?" Doc Eleanor's voice cut through like a blade. She stepped forward, the locket gleaming at her throat. "Over a man who's been scheming for his brother's land since before that brother died? Over a man who threatened Albert Hawkins repeatedly, documented in a journal we have. Over a man who's deeply in debt and trying to sell his niece's inheritance to pay gambling losses." She held up the locket. "Sarah Hawkins gave me this the day Lily was born, made me her daughter's godmother. And 3 years ago, when she lay dying under circumstances I never quite understood until now, she made me swear I'd protect Lily from her uncle." Doc's voice shook with fury. "She knew, Vernon. Your sister-in-law knew you were dangerous, and she tried to protect her child from you, even from her deathbed." Vernon's face had gone white, then red. "You can't prove any of this. That boot mark could be anyone's. That locket proves nothing about Uncle Vernon pushed me." Lily's voice was small, but clear as a bell ringing. She stepped away from him, moved toward the creek. "I didn't fall. He pushed me. I saw his face right before the mud hit." The crowd went dead silent. Even the creek seemed to hold its breath. Lily stood at the water's edge, her bandaged hand clutched to her chest, her whole body shaking, but her voice stayed steady. "He came to our ranch 3 days before. I heard him and my papa arguing. Papa said he'd never sell the water rights, never sign papers giving Uncle Vernon control. Uncle Vernon said accidents happen to stubborn men." She looked at Doc Eleanor, "like they happened to my mama." Doc's face went pale. "Lily, what do you mean?" "Uncle Vernon brought Mama medicine when she was sick. Special tea," he said, "to help her fever. But after she drank it, she got worse. Started shaking and couldn't breathe." Lily's voice broke. "I was only 6, but I remember. And I remember Uncle Vernon smiling when Papa wasn't looking." The silence was absolute. Then Vernon laughed, harsh and ugly, the sound of a man with nothing left to lose. "You can't prove that either. A child's memory from 3 years ago? The ravings of a traumatized orphan?" He looked at Judge McAllister. "Your Honor, this is a circus, not a legal proceeding. None of this would hold up in any court." "Maybe not," Marshal Reeves said. He'd moved closer without anyone noticing, and now he stood with his hand on his pistol. But it sure makes a man wonder, makes him want to ask questions, like why you needed a new coat right after the slide, like why you've been pressing so hard for land that ain't worth what you're claiming, like why a child would lie about her own kin trying to kill her. Judge McAllister looked sick. The crowd pressed closer, and I saw the shift happening. The ones who'd stood with Vernon backing away, distancing themselves from a man who suddenly looked less like a respectable landowner and more like exactly what he was. Vernon saw it too, saw his support crumbling, saw the noose tightening. His hand moved to his coat pocket. "Don't," Sam said quietly. He'd moved closer without sound, and now he stood between Vernon and Lily. "Enough people have died for that land. Don't add yourself to the count." Vernon's hand froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, he raised his hands away from his pockets. "I want a lawyer," he said, "and I want these charges presented formal, in a real court. Not this," he gestured at the creek, the crowd, the whole tableau of his exposure. "This mockery." "You'll get your court," Marshal Reeves said. He pulled out handcuffs, moved toward Vernon. "But right now I'm taking you into custody on suspicion of attempted murder and fraud. You can explain yourself to the territorial judge when he rides through next month." The handcuffs clicked shut around Vernon's wrists, and something in his face collapsed. Not guilt or remorse, just the recognition that his schemes were done, his power broken. As the marshal led him away, Lily ran to Doc Eleanor. The old woman caught her, held her while the girl finally cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like grief and relief and terror all mixed together. Reverend Webb stood in the creek, water rushing around him, and spoke quiet words that somehow carried to every ear. The Lord said, "I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten." Today, we've seen restoration begin. Today, we've seen truth surface like water finding its level. He looked at Lily, still clutching Doc Eleanor. And today, we witness that justice, when it finally comes, tastes like spring water, cold and pure and necessary as breath. The territorial judge arrived 2 weeks later, a hard man named Silas Brennan, who'd seen every scheme the Frontier could devise and wasn't impressed by much. He held court in Bridger's town hall, and, this time, the room was packed with folks who'd been at the creek baptism. Vernon sat at the defendant's table, his expensive lawyer beside him looking worried. The evidence was laid out like cards in a poker hand. The boot print cast Sam had made, the torn fabric from Vernon's coat, Albert's journal with its documented threats, the surveyor's stake proving property line fraud, and Doc Eleanor's testimony about Sarah Hawkins's deathbed warning. The lawyer tried. Said the boot print was circumstantial, that the fabric could have come from anywhere, that the journal was water damaged and inadmissible, that a dying woman's words weren't reliable. But then Judge Brennan called Lily to testify. She walked to the front in a new dress Doc had made for her bandaged hand finally free of wrappings. The frostbite had healed, though 2 fingers would always be stiff. She stood straight and spoke clear, and this time there was no Vernon to make her scared. "My uncle came to our ranch 3 days before the mudslide," she said. "I heard him tell my papa that accidents happen. Then, 3 days later, I was walking by the creek, and he came up behind me. He didn't say nothing, just pushed hard. I fell, and the mud came down." "Why didn't you run?" the judge asked, not unkind. "I tried, but my dress caught on a root, and the mud was so heavy, I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die." Her voice stayed steady. "Then Mr. Thorne dug me out. He saved me when my uncle wanted me dead." Vernon's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the defense request—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Brennan said. He looked at Vernon, and his expression was colder than January wind. "I've seen a lot of bad men in my years on the bench. Most of them had reasons. Desperation, anger, fear. But a man who'd murder his own kin for land money, who'd poison his sister-in-law and try to bury his niece alive." He shook his head. "That's a special kind of evil." The gavel came down. "Vernon Moss, I find you guilty of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to defraud an heir. I sentence you to 20 years in the territorial prison at Laramie. Your assets are forfeit to cover court costs and restitution." He looked at Doc Eleanor. "Dr. Pritchard, as Lily's godmother, with documented standing, I'm granting you full guardianship. The Hawkins Ranch remains in Lily's name, held in trust until she reaches majority or marries." Doc's hand found mine under the table, squeezed hard. "And Mr. Thorne," the judge continued, "for your actions in saving this child's life and bringing these crimes to light, the court grants you permanent water easement across the Hawkins property, no fee, in perpetuity. Miss Lily will need a good neighbor as she grows. Seems like she's got one." The courtroom erupted in noise. Some cheering, some protesting, most just relieved it was over. Vernon sat motionless as the marshal cuffed him again, his face empty as a house with no one home. As they let him out, he looked at me once. No threat this time, no calculation. Just the hollow stare of a man who'd gambled everything on greed and lost. 2 Sundays later, Doc Eleanor hosted dinner at her clinic, which she'd been able to keep now that the banker's loan had mysteriously been forgiven by the territorial banking board. Something about irregularities in the foreclosure process that nobody wanted to examine too close. The clinic's back room smelled of roast chicken and fresh bread, Doc's herb bundles hanging from the rafters mixing sage and lavender with the scent of home cooking. The table was crowded. Me and Doc, Sam Redbone and his granddaughter, Reverend Webb, Marshall Reeves, even the schoolteacher, Ada Morrison, who'd started this whole unraveling with her questions, and Lily, sitting between Doc and me, her plate piled high, her face finally showing something that looked like peace. "Thorne?" she said, quiet enough that only I could hear over the table conversation. "Will you teach me about fence mending? Doc says it's important work, keeping boundaries clear." I looked at this child who'd survived her uncle's murder attempts, who'd spoken truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, who'd lost both parents but somehow still had enough trust left to ask for help. "I'll teach you," I said. "Every morning if you want. Fences need checking regular, and it's good time for thinking. What do you think about when you check fences?" Used to think about what I'd lost. My wife, my son, who never drew breath, all the years that went by empty. I paused. But lately I've been thinking about what I found instead. Sometimes loss makes room for different kinds of family. The kind you choose, the kind that chooses you back. Lily smiled, and it was like watching spring come to the valley, slow, cautious, but inevitable. Around the table, conversation flowed easy. Sam was telling Webb about the proper way to bless new buildings, the Reverend arguing good-naturedly about theology versus tradition. Marshall Reeves was discussing property law with Ada Morrison, both of them trying to figure out what other legal irregularities Vernon might have committed. Doc Eleanor caught my eye across the table, raised her coffee cup in silent toast. I raised mine back, acknowledging what we both knew. We'd saved more than a child's life. We'd saved the idea that truth still mattered, that community could stand against power when it finally chose to look. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the valley gold and orange. Through the window, I could see Mercury Creek running clear and strong, washing away the last traces of mudslide and murder. Winter was over, spring had come, and for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't checking fences alone. I'm 70 now, sitting on this same porch where I sat that January morning when the mountain decided to speak. The fence wire still sings in the wind, though my hands shake too much these days to splice it proper. That's Lily's job now, or I should say Lily Thorne, since she took my name legal when Doc passed 5 years back. She's 31, married to a good man from up north, and she's got a daughter of her own. Little Sarah, named for the grandmother she never knew, 8 years old, with her mama's blue eyes and her great-grandfather Albert's stubborn spine. This morning I watched Lily teach Sarah how to check fence tension, how to read the wire's song for weak spots and needed repairs. The girl's hands are small and careful, learning the work the same way her mama learned it from me. As meditation, as connection to the land and the lives it holds. Vernon Moss died in Laramie Prison 6 years into his sentence. Gambling debts, they said, though some whispered it was rougher justice than that. I felt nothing when I heard, some men are lessons, not losses. Doc Eleanor lived to 80, delivered Lily's baby, and passed in her sleep with her godmother's locket still around her neck. Sam Redbone went the winter before that, peacefully, facing sunrise like he'd done every morning of his life. Reverend Webb retired and moved to California, and Marshall Reeves became mayor of Bridger. The Hawkins Ranch, Lily's ranch, still borders mine. That creek still runs between our properties, clear and cold and necessary as breath. We share the water like neighbors should, the way Albert and I did before greed tried to dam it. Some folk ask if I ever regretted stopping that morning, risking everything for a child who wasn't mine. Hell no. Lily taught me that grief ain't empty space, it's room for more love, just different shaped. Doc taught me that promises to the dying are promises to the living. Sam taught me that the earth keeps better records than any courthouse. And that little girl in the mud, barely breathing, holding onto torn fabric like it was proof the world could still be set right. She taught me that family's not about blood. It's about who you'd walk through a blizzard for, who you'd dig out of mud for, who you'd stand against the law for when the law's forgotten what justice means. The wire sings. Sarah laughs, having just made her first proper splice. Lily's voice carries across the morning, proud and patient, teaching the next generation how to mend what breaks. Spring comes every year, I've learned. Just takes its damn time about it, but it comes.